of the countries that we worked with were thinking about or undergoing some sort of reform of their upper secondary certification and assessment systems. And I think being able to, if you like, sell those reforms to their wider public was in fact a big issue for all of them.
Hello and welcome to the TES Community.Network. I hope you're safe and well. So that was just a snippet from today's interview with Rebecca Frankum and Lena Gray. And they've been working on a piece of research for the OECD, which has been looking at upper secondary education. It's a fantastic piece of research. You'll find a link to the research in the podcast notes, in the show notes. And what they really did, they looked across 38 countries. They looked at their I think it was 71 certification programs, and they looked at the balance of between course-based work, kind of continuous assessment approaches, and then a summative assessment to see which ones were the best kind of approaches. And I'm not going to spoil it for you, but there were some really fascinating insights that came from that. Also, just as ever, when you turn a stone over, you just find more things to look at. And in the conversation, we look at kind of potential future research avenues that would be great to go down. Before we start today, though, I've got a couple of quick announcements for you. So let me just bring this on stage. So last week we had, there we go, we had the research sprint, final webinar from the what's the impact of using AI to author items. And as part of that, came out of that research was a guide for anyone who's looking to use AI to write item types. So using either ChatGPT, some of the models out there, what models you might use, whether you're using a vendor-based platform, whether you're going into Microsoft Agents, so all the different avenues that you could go down. And this just kind of plotted out some recommendations and guidance to how in terms of best practice that you're in there and how to go about that. So it's a amazing amount of ways. You've got best practice, minimum practice, significant risk. You've got all these kind of sections, pre-item exposure, just so many things. And then what I also did in the webinar, which you can find on the TES Community.Network website, you can download the guide here as well. Let me put the link up there. Yeah. So if you go to that link there, you scan that QR code, you go straight to the guide. And the webinar I went through and demonstrated item authoring tool that I built, which took you through this kind of two-stage step. And that's my recommendation from this, is that rather than going for zero-shot item generation, you need to go through a two-stage process, and the guide will walk you through that in a bit more detail. I also kind of expanded a bit on the use of a thing called Skills MD file. So in a couple of weeks' time, I've got another webinar that's coming up, which is about vibe coding, skills files. So it's just a brilliant opportunity for you to kind of just catch up where we are in the AI space. The other thing that I brought out last week as well was another report. This one's about using AI for marking. So this is a piece of work that I did with Synaptic. They were guests as part of some work we did with consultants. We did a webinar with them, and out of the back of that, we kind of came up with this report, which looks at the idea of glass box and black box marking, and it just walks you through the difference between what kind of deterministic explainable AI looks like and what generative AI does, and how those two differ, and why you might want to be looking at more explainable if you're wanting to offload more of that decision-making process on the market. And obviously, Ofqual, the regulators, people like that have got their opinions on this, but that's another one you can check out. So the QR code for that one, I'll leave the QR code up. Move these around, there we go. So if you scan that QR code or put that link in there, it will take you to it. But on to today's show. So let's put the interview up. And here's me in conversation with Rebecca Frankum and Lena Gray. Rebecca, Lena, thank you for joining me. You're well?
Yes, they're good. Thanks for having us.
Excellent. So you've been working on a fantastic piece of research for the OECD. It was published very recently. You ran a webinar. I attended it. There was lots of great conversation, lots of great chatter. And do you want to walk us through it, Rebecca? Do you want to tell us about the scope, what the coverage of it, and also just introduce yourself as well as go through?
Sure. Thanks, Tim. So my name's Rebecca. I work at the OECD. I'm in a team focusing on upper secondary education. So as you might be aware, the OECD is an international organisation focusing on policy, and specifically in the scope of my role, it's education policy. And we started the report, we started working on this project and published this report recently, focusing on assessment and certification, particularly looking at high stakes assessment in upper secondary. And that's because, as you know, I'm sure the people listening know that the school leaving certificates, the qualifications that young people get when they finish school are deeply important for their lives. They matter for their lives as they transition to their next steps. That might be higher education, might be further education, might be employment. They matter deeply for society. They set the goalposts of what it is that we want young people to achieve. And this is something that in our work at the OECD, when we're talking with countries, with members of the OECD, when we're talking with people working in ministries of education and qualification agencies, these are topics that, come up a lot. How do certificates need to evolve, maybe in the modern day? How can they reflect the skills that we really value in curriculum? And what might they need to look like in the future? So that's what we've been working on with the report. Firstly, understanding what countries are doing at the moment and thinking about why things are the way that they are.
Excellent. And in terms of the views that people have, it's quite a polarized kind of view that people have had over time, isn't it? Just some people believe in that one particular format in terms of external assessment is the best way forward, whereas other countries have had teacher-based assessment methods. Some countries have migrated across and moved around. It's all kind of been there's a huge mix, isn't there? And a huge difference across all kind of areas. What were the kind of key findings then, particularly around that kind of internally and externally assessment process? What were your kind of key findings from that?
Yeah, it's really interesting because depending on where you come from in the world, you're probably going to have very different views around, what a traditional approach to assessment looks like. In some countries, exams have been the dominant method for centuries. In other countries, teacher-based assessment is really the thing that, drives what assessment looks like in upper secondary education, and it really drives what it is that you get at the end. So what we wanted to do was look across countries and understand in a bit more detail where the differences are and also what different countries are doing. So as a part of the report, we undertook a mapping exercise with 38 different systems. And through that, we mapped 71 different certificates. So in some countries, they will have both general and vocational certificates. So we looked at both. And with that, we mapped, what kind of assessment formats are used for high stakes assessment for upper secondary certification. Are they, naturally occurring evidence, projects and portfolios, practical activities, and performances, exam type assessment methods as well. We looked at that, and we also asked, what about the responsibilities? So who is setting and marking the assessment? And what about the conditions and the timing of how it's delivered? So is that under strictly controlled conditions? Is that at the very end of the program? And what we did, which I think is a wee bit different to some other work I've seen in the past, is that we looked at each of these factors independently. The temptation was to say who has exams and then who has teacher-based assessment. But actually there was quite a lot of variation in what we saw. So, some countries might have exams which are externally set, but then marked by teachers, or vice versa. And many countries also have assessment formats which are projects that are externally marked. So it was quite difficult to actually create binaries in the work that we did. But if I try and simplify it, what we found is that there were three types of systems. So the smallest category was of systems or certificates which are entirely externally assessed and predominantly using external exams. Then there was about 10 of the 71 certificates there. The next category was certificates which are entirely internally assessed with no external exams. And we had 19 certificates in that category. And then the remainder was the largest category, which combined both. So internal assessment and external exams, complementing each other in some way, contributing in some way to students' final results. So that was the most common type of certificate that we observed.
Excellent. And Lena, you were a consultant supporting this research, weren't you, as part of the process? And there was particularly the area of I'm going to ask you about continuous and kind of an program. What kind of discovery around the value of both those approaches? Because I suppose someone might look at it and think, okay, so continuous is the idea that you could soften the kind of pressure, I suppose, on the assessment process, whereas that kind of end of program, it's more of a kind of traditional standardized approach, isn't it? Because you get that level playing field across the process, and the logistics in there is manageability. What were the kind of discovery as part of that process?
I think it was really just what we've already started to hint at here, that polarised and binary arguments just don't hold when you look at what happens in practice. And in terms, for example, of continuous assessment versus, if you like, endpoint assessment, you get the proponents of each who will argue for their advantages, but each has advantages and disadvantages. So you take endpoint assessment, as you say, it's a one-off. It doesn't give a true picture of student skills and knowledge. Those who don't support that might even say it's unfair. Those who do support it would say, well, unseen tasks in exam-like conditions, they create that level playing field, so it's fairer. So you've got those two opposing views sometimes within the one system, kind of looking at that one assessment type. And then on the kind of flip side, looking at continuous assessment, the arguments for it would be, well, there's multiple opportunities, the student has more chances to show what they can do, therefore it's less stressful, it's not that one-off occasion, so it's fairer. Yeah. But actually, we found some research asking students what they thought of it, and the manageability aspect is a very, very important factor there that's often missed out, because students will say, I feel as if I'm always being assessed. Yeah. I feel as if it's constant pressure in the classroom. I feel as if I'm not getting a chance to prepare, to do my best and show what I can do. And so I feel it's less fair. So for each of these types of assessment, there are different advantages and disadvantages. It all comes down to what is fit for purpose for that use. And I think the thing that we feel is a useful contribution in the report was to come up with these 4 principles that could be used to try and evaluate the fitness for purpose. They're not technical principles. They're not something that you need to bring in an assessment expert or a statistician to help you to evaluate. They are about how the assessment works within the certification. Our 4 principles of relevance, credibility, fairness, and manageability. And for each different assessment, it's all about balancing and finding what you want the appropriate balance to be for the intended use of that particular assessment.
Yeah, okay, and that's really, really important. I think when I was reading through, I think there was examples in there that I think it was New Zealand where they'd introduced some continuous based assessment processes, which made it quite an unmanageable process, or some of the feedback had come through. So yeah, I think it needs to be manageable, doesn't it, as part of that process. Higher education obviously is a kind of a significant milestone, isn't it, in terms of the learning journey. How much influence does that have on the assessment process, Lena? Is it impacting the innovation that can be in there? Is it restricting things, or is it aiding the process of assessment process selection?
I think here again, it varies from system to system, and it's easy when you're sitting in one system to assume that how your system operates is how it operates elsewhere. But where higher education has to operate some sort of selection, and it doesn't in every system for every course, then obviously they are going to be concerned with credibility that allows them to feel and to have a kind of face validity that says that they are selecting on the basis of some agreed criterion. So credibility, reliability tend to be what they're looking for, and that does mean tending to fall back on external assessment in exam type conditions and so on. However, also in many systems now, we see higher education as a kind of key advocate, if you like, for the importance of higher order skills, for the importance also of things like attitudes and values, the kind of personal confidence, resilience, independence, critical thinking, all of these things that they see young people need to have to achieve in higher education, but also need to have to be able to cope with the demands of modern life when they leave higher education. And because that's a big concern there, in some systems, in small ways, maybe, they are certainly starting to be able to lead the debate, if you like, about how can we assess these very important skills differently, because they are much harder to evidence through your traditional exam-based external assessment type of assessment. So I think they have the power to be both of those types of forces within systems. I think that is all about opening up that debate and getting people together to share those views and innovate step by step, maybe.
Yeah. I think it's not looking at it in isolation, isn't it? It's it's a all continuous part of the machine, I suppose, of learning and preparation for life. I know, reflecting back on my university time, I think back at the knowledge that I gained from my course was one aspect of it, but the life skills, the learning skills, the ability to learn, those other aspects were really quite an important part of the process. Obviously, Rebecca, when you go through a research process like this, I suppose all you're doing is just lifting the lid, aren't you, on other kind of opportunities. What other kind of research opportunities did you identify as you go through this? Because you only have a finite amount of time, and I suppose you would love to spend a lot more time, but you've got to draw a line, don't you? But what did you discover?
Absolutely. There's so much more that we could look into, and there's so much more that I'm personally quite interested to look into. We also want to make sure at the OECD that the work that we're doing is really relevant and interesting for the countries that we work with. So one direction that we hope to take this work in the future is looking more in depth at the marking and the moderation and the standard setting side of it. Yeah. Because as Lena hinted at just then, what countries are increasingly doing, particularly some countries that have traditionally been very exam-based are beginning to include more non-exam assessment formats in their certificates. For example, if we look in Ireland, and what that's doing is introducing assessment formats that are maybe more able to assess a wider range of skills, skills that might be difficult to assess in exam contexts. But what countries often seem to struggle with, and what we're hearing from the country representatives that we talk to, is when those types of assessment methods are being assessed by teachers, that can create anxieties in a system that is designed to facilitate selection to higher education around the fairness and the consistency of those grades that are being awarded, or is it year on year consistent, the way that students' grades are being given? Is it consistent across schools? So that's one of the things that we know countries are quite interested in, that we want to do more work on, and I think that will hopefully be a nice segue from the work that we've done so far, that we can look more in that marking and moderation space. But personally, I'm also quite interested in, assessment. It's high stakes, but it also still needs to be something that is useful to the learner, useful for that next step, because you don't stop learning, the day that you leave school. You might go to higher education, you might get a job, you might do all sorts of other forms of learning in your life, whether it's in a formal education setting or not. And so it's really, I think, interesting to still think about assessment that is being used in these summative ways. How can it also still be useful to the learner? And so, there's some examples of things like self-assessment and peer assessment, which are difficult to introduce into a high stakes context. And I think, should it be? Maybe not. But that's something that I'm really interested to look more in, as well as, for young people as they're reaching maturity where they've got more metacognition and self-awareness, maybe there's space for thinking more and looking at what that could look like.
Yeah. What about yourself, Lena? Did you identify any kind of new opportunities as you went through the research?
As you said, Tim, there are always new opportunities. You always have to close that lid on some questions that you open when you're in a research project and say, no, we can't go there. I think a couple of things that I thought were most interesting for next steps. Rebecca's mentioned how you assure the quality, or convince others that there is quality in teacher assessment. And I think an aspect of that particularly interests me is how teachers can be supported, not only to have the knowledge and skills they would need in order to ensure their assessments are as valid and reliable as they can be, but also so that they feel the confidence to be able to exercise those assessment skills with their learners and in conversations with parents and so on. And I think that sense of how best to support teachers and how they can support each other is a really important issue for further research. And the other one, in kind of common with Rebecca, we were very conscious. We had some engagement with students during this project, but across each individual system, we were not able to gather what students felt about the particular system they were part of, what their experience of that was, and what the impact on them was of that assessment system at upper secondary, and what that meant for their later progression and so on. I think there's a whole wealth of research opportunities in there in terms of the student experience. And just to add one last thing that I think is really important is the assessment culture within a country, because we often talk about the main players in an assessment system as if they are the ones with all the influence. But actually, there are assessment cultures that can exist out there almost as a kind of public or national part of their identity that assessment organisations and policymakers can find really difficult to shift and can be quite resistant to one change or another, maybe completely valuing teacher professionalism and thinking that any input that's external is somehow an insult to that, or on the opposite side, completely valuing external exam-based assessment and feeling that any teacher assessment can't quite be trusted or doesn't have credibility. And I think some research into how those assessment cultures grow and how they can be changed is something that is really important, because most of the countries that we worked with, we're thinking about or undergoing some sort of reform of their upper secondary certification and assessment systems. And I think being able to, if you like, sell those reforms to their wider public was in fact a big issue for all of them.
Yeah, but I think you see it's a political issue as well, isn't it? It can almost change a government. If there's a failing in the national exam cycle, it can have that big impact. And I've seen it over the years. Many organisations have said, "Well, let's look at New Zealand or let's look at Finland, and well, how are they doing it?" And actually, I think it was Sweden have gone in one direction but going back. Countries are constantly kind of shifting and changing their views on this. So I suppose to that question, then you must have discovered as part of this research, what is the perfect approach? Is there a perfect approach? Lena, is there one? Is there a perfect approach?
Absolutely not. No. There is no perfect approach. There is only what is appropriate for that purpose, in that context, at that time. And finding the way through that and finding the right balance of the four principles that we've suggested requires, I think, extensive discussion amongst the range of stakeholders involved. For me, there is no right or wrong. There's no way to go out and measure something and say, right, this is it, this is how we do it. There's only what fits within that system at that particular point. There's no angels and devils. Polarisation isn't helpful. It's about balancing, and it's probably in the end, as we found in most of our systems, about a mix. Yeah. And Rebecca, I assume you kind of support that view as well.
Absolutely. And I think what's important as well in a changing world is that the fundamental questions remain the same. What we need to be asking is, well, what is the purpose of this assessment, of the certificate that young people are achieving at the end of schooling? Is it just, set them on their way with higher education? That can depend a lot on the country context. It can depend how competitive higher education is to enter. It can depend on, how the certificate is designed. Is it setting a minimum benchmark? Is it giving students some kind of a rank score, point score in order to enter? Is the role of the certificate to be a broad-based credential that young people have what they need for adult life and society? Is it, something that we want all young people to achieve? Once you ask and get answers to those fundamental questions, then it becomes quite simple, right? Then it's, what is it that we want students to be learning? What do we want to be assessing? And designing good assessments is always going to be the most important thing. So at the end of the day, It's simple.
I think
It's not quite that simple.
The context, we can come up with the best plan or best formula, can't you, for each country in context? But the landscape of where they're in is shifting, and the AI surge that we're seeing at the moment is making another profound shift. And I think the important part is to continue doing these research exercises and continue learning from the experiences, mapping it out, having these conversations, so that we can, like you say, continuously identify opportunities for delivery. And continue learning from the experiences, mapping it out, having these conversations, so that we can, like you say, continuously identify opportunities for delivering those best assessments. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. I do strongly recommend to all the listeners, and I'll put the link in the show notes as well, so people can go off and read the research. And I'm sure you're more than happy to be connected with and asked further questions via social media as well. I'll put your LinkedIn profiles in there. Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Great piece of research, and really appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Tim.
Cheers, guys. Excellent. That was really good. I'm really sorry about the end bit there. Just I was moving my one tab from another tab, and it for some reason paused the video. So, but anyway, you got to hear the end bit. I was worried I'd trimmed it off somehow. So, if you are listening to this on Thursday the 2nd, then obviously you've got the Easter break ahead of you, if that's what you celebrate. If you don't, then I hope you have a wonderful weekend. If you're celebrating Easter and you're having lots of chocolate, then enjoy. Don't eat too much. I will try my best not to as well. Next week, we're going to have a bit of a highlights session. I've got some kind of nice little some really good snippets to share with you as it's the Easter holidays, and a lot of you won't be around. But then we'll be back into some other great presentations and sessions coming up over the next few weeks. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful time. Don't forget to download the links. You'll find the links in the show notes. I'll have them in there as well. They're on the Test Community Network website. And as ever, anything you see on here, if you go to the Test Community Network, subscribe for free, you get a lovely weekly email. There's some really good stuff in this week. Glasses, smart glasses. Yeah, you want to check that out. So anyway, take care, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye-bye.